Alas, O compassionate Guru, I am an ignorant woman, a creation of delusion, lost in negative karma. Embrace me with your compassion. Now cleanse every evil state. Never leave me, Lord. Be kind. The object of my journey to Nepal is accomplished. I found the youth Arya Saleh without mistake. Now I beg you for entry into the mysteries, and with compassion dispel the obstacles on my path. Today we will talk about silver and the Tibetan economy, as well as some of the decisions made by His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama. I had this book for a while. I've never read it from cover to back, but it's very well researched by a Videshi, a foreigner. Here he talks about gauze worn by Tibetan children and women and by Indian hill people. They are suspended from the neck as a central pendant on a string of beads. Tibetan men use gauze in different ways. For example, in pre-Chinese Tibet, a small roundish gao was worn by government officials of the fourth rank and above, fixed in their hair-plaited top knot, pachok, as an indication of high rank. Tibetan men and sometimes women use another type when undertaking a journey in perilous mountain terrain. These are usually a box form, and most can stand on a flat base. Made in a wide range of sizes, they are often carried on the right side of the body, suspended by a cord or strap that passes over the left shoulder. The gao is a complex form, function, and symbolism. It can be of copper, brass, or bronze, and combinations of these. Many are made of silver, which may be used for the entire object, or only its visible front, in which case the back half is usually copper, brass, or sheet iron. In Tibet, silver objects may be partially or completely mercury fire gilded. Tibet is rich in gold, and those who can afford it have their gaos made of that precious metal. Because only a limited amount of gold is local, precious metals as well as copper and brass were also imported over great distances from India and from China via Mongolia by human and animal transport. Another source of silver was obtained by melting Indian and Chinese silver coins when silver currency was in circulation. In Ladakh, besides using the forms that are typically Tibetan, women wear a necklace consisting of a series of miniature backless gaos of double-sided oval form. In central and western Tibet, women show a preference for the square, some with projecting points on all four sides. Their size can range from small to enormous. No matter what the gao shape, its top is provided with either a single tube or one made in three parts, two of which are attached to the front half and one to the back half. Following the failed talks, there was a clash in 1917 and 1918 between Tibetan troops and Chinese garrison troops led by a Sichuanese general. Eric Teichmann, the British consular agent stationed at Kangding, stepped in and negotiated a truce to stop Tibetans from taking all over Kham. By 1920, the 13th Dalai Lama had considered the development of a modernized, well-equipped Tibetan army, along with the implementation of internal modernization reforms, as imperative for his nation. Yet requirements for this army, such as the maintenance of a strong military force, ideally including 15,000 new troops on the Sino-Tibetan border, the purchase of munitions and electrical machinery from India, as well as the realization of huge projects such as the hydroelectric and road building schemes, all required heavy expenditure. The Tibetan government was therefore forced to extract new revenue from the traditional estate holders and aristocratic families. More significantly, for the first time, the Dalai Lama required the Gyasi Lumpo, the Panchen Lama's monastery, to bear a quarter of the total financial burden of the army. The Panchen Lama and his followers refused, and after several unsuccessful protests by the Gyasi Lumpo, the Panchen Lama secretly fled to China proper via Kokonor and Inner Mongolia on 26 December 1923. So that was like this time 100 years ago. Wow. It's a 100-year anniversary. By 1928 to 29, Tibet's economic and financial situation had further deteriorated, coinciding with the Great Depression. The price of wool in the world market had dropped catastrophically since the mid-1920s, and given that wool was Tibet's chief export, the Tibetan government was seriously handicapped by a lack of money. It was extremely hard to see how money would be forthcoming to meet the requirement of the new deals proposed by the government, such as the building operations in the Potala Palace and the Summer Palace Norbalinka, and particularly the maintenance of the huge number of Tibetan troops equipped with the necessary arms and ammunition. In addition, by 1929, the Lhasa government was badly in need of Indian silver because the whole of Tibet was suffering severely from a flood of counterfeit copper coins, the only coin in circulation. In order to prevent a currency crisis, the Tibetan government was forced to withdraw all the devalued copper coins from circulation and replace them with silver ones. Since Tibet itself possessed no silver deposits, the import of Indian silver was required. Consequently, the Dalai Lama declared that one of the richest and most influential trade families in Tibet, Pangda-tsang, the only family able to supply the necessary gold and silver bullion to Lhasa, would take up the wool monopoly in exchange for the purchase of Indian rupees and silver coins. This new measure caused widespread dissatisfaction among Tibetans almost everywhere. With wool being monopolized by one merchant, the mass of Tibetan traders had few means either to obtain Indian silver or to exchange Indian goods for daily necessities. In the long run, the Tibetans would inevitably have to face the likelihood of disastrous inflation and the deficiency of commodities. According to British reports, by mid-1930, the price of Indian and Chinese merchandise was several times higher than usual, and the exchange rate for Indian money had suddenly risen 15-fold in Lhasa. The old Chinese imperial coins, zangyang, were circulating again in Lhasa and were hoarded by the Tibetan merchants, who were convinced that a shortage of Indian money was imminent. Despite being forbidden to do so, the exasperated Tibetans fearlessly sent a petition to the Lhasa authorities to appeal for the removal of the wool monopoly. Faced with such dire economic and financial circumstances, the Dalai Lama had few alternatives. Not surprisingly, he first turned to the British for assistance. But the government of India informed him that it was merely willing to consider allowing the Tibetans to establish custom houses to impose taxes on goods imported from India and Nepal, and was prepared to let Lhasa buy silver at preferential rates to meet the monetary crisis. In order to guarantee the long-term welfare of his country, the Dalai Lama urgently needed to increase sources of income by searching out new markets and to reduce governmental expenditure by postponing huge projects and, most importantly, cutting the size of the Tibetan army. It was these considerations that contributed to the 13th Dalai Lama's declaration of good faith in the newly inaugurated KMT regime in Nanking. In 1929, Chiang Kai-shek had just completed the Northern Expedition and reunified the whole of China, so the Dalai Lama regarded him as the new strongman. The Dalai Lama anticipated that his goodwill would enable Chiang to exercise influence over the warlords in Sichuan and Xikang. The military tension on the border might be relieved as a result, and perhaps a definite boundary between Tibet and China could be satisfactorily demarcated. The Dalai Lama expected that the improving Sino-Tibetan relationship would meanwhile favor the export of Tibetan goods, such as wool, skins, yak tails, and Tibetan herbs, into the markets of China proper and earn Tibet the money needed to meet the financial requirements of his government. The Dalai Lama even considered the possibility of gaining both military and technical support from the Chinese, the former including the purchase of arms from Nanking, and the latter comprising possible offers of weaving and leather manufacturing machines, together with skilled workers from China proper. In August 1929, the Dalai Lama indicated that the Tibetan abbot of the Peking Lama temple, Koncho Chungne, who had been appointed by him to this post in 1922, should contact nationalist officials. The Dalai Lama was aware that the Chinese authorities would never tire of listening to the sweet talk of Tibet's possible return to the Chinese Republic, an enticement that could well serve as a bargaining card. On various occasions, therefore, the abbot and his representatives repeatedly endeavored to create the impression that a form of political reintegration between Tibet and China was not impossible. When meeting with Lin Hsiao-Ting in Peking, Koncho Chungne explained that the Dalai Lama was by no means pro-British. Tibet was geographically adjacent to British India, so the Dalai Lama was perforce to associate with the British. When Koncho Chungne later had his audience with Chiang Kai-shek, he once again explained that the Dalai Lama and his government truly cherished the traditional relationship with the Chinese and were thinking about further strengthening Tibet's ties with nationalist China. Yet Koncho Chungne did not forget to take this opportunity to ask for more support from Nanking. He particularly mentioned to Chiang Kai-shek the price of Chinese border tea, which had become an everyday necessity for the Tibetans. The tension in the Xikang Tibetan border areas had caused a tenfold rise in the normal price of Chinese tea, which placed a heavy burden on ordinary Tibetans. The Dalai Lama's envoy therefore urged Nanking to help improve the frosty relationship between Lhasa and the Chinese warlords in the southwest. The Dalai Lama's representation of good faith was welcomed as expected by the nationalist government. Two messengers, Koncho Chungne himself and Miss Liu Manqing, a junior official with Chinese Tibetan parentage, reached Lhasa in 1930, and they both were cordially received by the Dalai Lama. Shortly after these exchanges of message bearers, a permanent Tibetan representative office was set up in Nanking, subsidized partially by the nationalist government. A channel of communication that had been suspended for nearly 2 decades now seemed to be nearing the point where it might be re-established. Yet that was not the end of the story. While the 13th Dalai Lama was carefully using the Tibetan issue as political leverage, he was inadvertently offering a golden opportunity to the nationalists. The Dalai Lama may well be unaware that while the KMT authorities never ceased to proclaim to the whole world their unyielding commitment to national reunification, they avoided dealing with insoluble frontier issues. Foreign Minister Wang Zhengting addressed a note to the British legation at Peking requesting that a new commercial treaty to be drawn.
Yet it did not mention the border trading posts in Tibet, to the British people's surprise. Their reasoning
was that since 1891, since the trade mart was opened in Yatong, the Qing court and the subsequent Chinese Republican government did not collect taxes from the trade marts. There would be no economic gain or loss if they kept these issues aside when they renewed their commercial agreement with the British. While it may have been difficult for the Nanking officials to determine the extent to which they should direct their energy toward frontier concerns, the settlement of which were far from relevant to their immediate problems in China proper, it was much easier to create propaganda and act as if they were indeed concerned about China's frontier and minority issues. In this regard, Nanking did achieve a considerable degree of success. Both Koncho Chungne and Liu Manqing's trip to Lhasa, along with the establishment of a Tibetan representative office in the capital and Peking, attracted considerable attention both domestically and internationally. The Chinese mass media wasted no time in praising the development of Han-Tibetan Brotherhood, and officials of the British government of India were also astonished by the sudden reinforcement of Chinese influence over Tibet. The Tibetan police had a conflict in the spring of 1930, to which this book turns. Relations between Tibet and Nepal turned sour since August 1929. The cause was Lhasa's maltreatment of a Tibetan Nepalese named S. Gyalpo, who was arrested by Lhasa on charges of smuggling and minting counterfeit Tibetan copper coins. The Nepalese claimed that he was a Nepalese subject, while the Tibetans refused to heed such an argument. Gyalpo then escaped from custody and sought shelter in the Nepalese residency at Lhasa. The Tibetan police entered the residency and took Gyalpo away, a move that provoked the outrage of the Nepalese prime minister, who in February 1930 ordered mobilization in preparation for war against Tibet. These tensions between the two countries inevitably placed a heavy burden on Tibetan military defense. On hearing the news, Nanking immediately informed the 13th Dalai Lama of its willingness to send troops and officials to assist the Tibetans in their fight against the Nepalese. When the thankful Dalai Lama tactfully turned down any possible entry of Han Chinese troops and officials into his kingdom, Nanking continued to display its goodwill by promising to exercise diplomatic pressure on both British India and Nepal over the Tibetan-Nepalese issue. In retrospect, it is obvious that this was mere lip service, but in 1930, messages of this type did indeed create the profound impression that the nationalist government was unequivocally concerned for the welfare of China's frontier territories. There was a lot of window dressing like this from the nationalist agenda. After the dispute had been peacefully resolved thanks to British mediation, two officials from Nanking secretly masqueraded as merchants and reached Kathmandu, the capital city of Nepal, via India in September 1930. The Nepalese were informed that they came in order to offer the services of the Chinese government to settle the dispute. While the Nepalese Prime Minister Bhim Shamsher was only too pleased to receive some handsome gifts from Nanking, he nevertheless repudiated all claims of the Chinese government to be involved in any question between Tibet and Nepal. From Nanking's perspective, however, this was not such a bitter blow. The cost of dispatching two officials to Nepal was not high, and the attitude of the Nepalese toward the Sino-Tibetan relationship was not of particular importance to the nationalists. But in terms of propaganda, the result was not merely a high-sounding declaration that would convince the Chinese people of the nationalists' determination to protect China's sovereignty. It was also a brilliant ploy that suggested it was Chiang Kai-shek's and Nanking's efforts that had led to the peaceful resolution between Tibet and Nepal. From the late 1930 until the end of 1932, several clashes occurred on the border, first between Tibet and Xikang, and then Tibet and Qinghai. In the Republican era, war was a commonplace phenomenon, and as Lucien W. Pai indicates, warfare usually played a decisive role in public affairs. Wars and military action often became the final arbiters in Chinese society, as well as a means of leverage for achieving political and economic objectives. Accordingly, it is of little significance to investigate in detail which of the two sides divided by the upper Yangtze, the de facto boundary between China and Tibet, was to blame for causing this particular conflict. The author goes on to discuss the importance of trade posts in determining the nature of these conflicts, but I think you get his point overall. Thanks so much for listening, and hope you guys have a happy new year. And perhaps we shall meet on the live stream of His Holiness the Dalai Lama this week. Bye!